Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 56. Today we journey to Conan Doyle's hometown of Edinburgh, where a young man falls foul of a mysterious mesmeric beauty, in John Barrington Cowles from 1884. And here's Paul to tell us more.
At Edinburgh University in 1879, a friendship is formed between two medical students, Robert Armitage and John Barrington Cowles. Beyond his scientific pursuits and achievements, Cowles is also interested in art, and at an exhibition at the Scottish Academy, his attention is drawn towards a beautiful woman named Kate Northcott. She, however, is already promised in marriage to a law student named Reeves, although not for long. Her fiancé dies in strange circumstances, and she and Cowles are soon engaged. But, as Armitage discovers, she is a woman with a veiled and sinister past, which matches her forceful and mysteriously magnetic personality. What is her secret? And how can her hold over his friend be broken?
Now, last episode we looked at The Bloodstone Tragedy, Conan Doyle's druidic tale, which was first published by Cassell's Saturday Journal in February 1884. Since then, we've chanced upon a letter from Conan Doyle to his mother, in which he describes all the things he was writing on at that time, including John Barrington Cowles. And it actually has the interesting detail that The Bloodstone Tragedy was a commission. Cassell sent him the request to write a story based on the Dr. Price tale, which Conan Doyle turned around in 3 days, which makes sense of the tight timeline we discussed in the last episode. That same letter, though, to Mary Doyle from Southsea and dated February 1884, reveals just how much Conan Doyle was working on simultaneously. He had, by this time, been resident in Southsea for a couple of years and was writing to supplement his income from his medical practice. But the letter also shows the difficulties that he was having in establishing his literary career. He just finished the story Our Midnight Visitor, which he'd sent to Temple Bar, but that wouldn't appear in print for another 7 years. He was also rewriting the narrative of John Smith, the novel that was lost in the post and rewritten from memory. That novel was eventually printed by the British Library in 2011. And he told his mother that he just had an idea for a story about, quote, the strange circumstances connected with the death of John Barrington Cowles, which may do for Cornhill. Summing up his various projects to his mother, he declared he was busy tending my little literary sprouts and making them into cabbages. A few days later, he wrote to his mother again, revealing he was hard at work on this new story, and a few days after that said he'd been grinding away all day at the extraordinary circumstances in connection with the death of John Barrington Cowles, which is rapidly assuming large proportions, which perhaps gives us a bit of an insight into how his stories adapted and changed as he actually got into the writing process. And in one of the letters that Conan Doyle writes to his mother, he proposed an idea for an anthology of his works to include John Barrington Cowles, which I think shines a light on some of the themes that we're going to talk upon in the podcast. He wrote, "What think you of Twilight Tales for a name? You see, it would have a double meaning, not only as being tales suitable for the gloaming, but as treating of the strange twilight land between the natural and the absolutely supernatural, brackets, animal magnetism, mesmerism, and these other acknowledged powers play a large part in them. Such tales as The Captain of the Pole Star, The Winning Shot, Habakkuk, John Barrington Cowles, brackets, which I am writing just now, and others would justify the title." Conan Doyle probably finished the story in March, and it was immediately accepted by Castles, who published it in 2 parts in their 12th and 19th of April 1884 issues. He hoped to get about £7 or £8 for it, but we don't know if he was that lucky. The story, though, was included in The Captain of the Pole Star and Other Tales in 1890, but it didn't make it into later collections, unlike its sister publication, The Parasite, from 1894, which is closely related to this, which was included in the 1930 Crowborough edition. The story was also included in an anthology of Conan Doyle's Edinburgh Tales with an introduction by Owen Dudley Edwards. And I think this story really does exude that Edinburgh feel. It's got a lot of sort of autobiographical information in there, as well as really exuding the feel of the Edinburgh New Town in particular.
Yeah, it's definitely it's something he was doubtless thinking of his student days at this point in his life. With some 4 or 5 years on from those, but there's a definite kind of almost air of nostalgia.
Yes.
It is such an Edinburgh story. I mean, in one way, it's surprising that he didn't try and push it at Blackwoods.
Yes.
Where he was trying to get in Blackwoods all the time, and the Edinburgh magazine, and with its kind of supernatural aspects, it's one he might have thought was ideal for them. But nevertheless, I think he's thinking along the lines, possibly because it's one of his animal magnetism, vampire-y sort of tales.
Yeah.
To ground it in a realistic background.
Yes. Yeah.
To give it a real air of verisimilitude, and then you've got this kind of fantastic story in a very realistic setting to try and ground it. So he plays. I mean, the streets he mentions. You've got John Barrington Cowles and Armitage living on Northumberland Street, which is a real street in the new town in Edinburgh, and just round the corner from where Kate Northcott's living with her aunt, Abercrombie Place, which interestingly Conan Doyle misspells. He spells it with an IE. It should actually end with a Y, and he makes the same mistake with the same word in A Foreign Office Romance, where he spells General Abercrombie.
Yes.
With an IE instead of a Y. So he obviously had some sort of block when it came to that word. But yeah, it just gives it this real air of the city. And you've also got tied into this the fact that Cowles first sees Kate Northcott at an exhibition.
Yes.
An art exhibition in Edinburgh. And this ties in with the world that Conan Doyle grew up in, obviously with his father being an artist who had exhibited in Edinburgh. So he's very much using the worlds he knows.
Yes.
And it's interesting as well that one of the pictures mentioned in this is by Sir Noel Peyton.
Yes.
Who is also mentioned in The Surgeon of Gastafell, where one of the paintings that is in the strange gallery in that is by Peyton. So he's tying all this stuff together. Yeah. So it's really having the autobiographical element, the realistic element, the very Scottish element as well is all in here.
Yeah.
We get the story moves out of Edinburgh later on. But remains in Scotland, where Cowles and Armitage undertake a Scottish tour and end up on the Isle of May off the Firth of Forth, and it's a very isolated location.
Yes,
which again, Conan Doyle enjoyed these sort of locations. He uses it in the story you've mentioned earlier, Our Midnight Visitor, set on the fictional Isle of Uffa, and also The Man from Archangel on the lonely Scottish coast. It's very much into these, and again, this may be a degree of think about his own past, because he had taken a well-remembered holiday in the Isle of Arran off the west coast of Scotland in the late 1870s with his sister and his father.
Yeah.
So all that's tying in, and I mean, there's one wonderful description of the Isle of May in John Barrington Cowles, where he talks, beyond the keeper of the lighthouse, there are only one or two families of poor fisherfolk who sustain a precarious existence by their nets and by the capture of cormorants and solan geese.
Yes.
You've got the poor fisherfolk, which makes you think of the poor folk upon the moor.
Yes, indeed.
But yes, you've got a lighthouse there, and you've got cormorants. So all you need is a politician. And you've got one of the unrecorded adventures of Sherlock Holmes. But yeah, it's a very, very, very Scottish story, a very evocative story. But ultimately, it is an Edinburgh story.
It is. I think there's a lot of family stuff in there as well. I mean, there's this lovely note about this Barrington Cowles living in Northumberland Street, and there's a reference there. My landlady in Northumberland Street had a large house, and being a widow without children, she gained a livelihood by providing accommodation for several students, which of course is what we know Mary Doyle was doing while her husband was incapacitated and taking in lodgers like Brian Charles Waller, who we've talked about previously. But I was struck by other things like the Neil Arnott Prize for Physics is referenced, and that's actually a real prize. It's actually still handed out to this day. It's now the Neil Arnott Scholarship in Experimental Physics. And Conan Doyle would later in life fund a scholarship in Edinburgh University in 1902, set up a scholarship fund for students from South Africa. But the other one is there, as you point out, is the artistic connections as well, because obviously, not only is there that reference to the Royal Scottish Academy, where Charles Doyle had exhibited, you also got, as you mentioned, that reference to Noel Paton. And it did make me wonder about what is the picture that he's looking at. And the only one I could really think of, the one that kind of is most celebrated and still in that connection now, is a preparatory piece for the Quarrel of Oberon and Titania, which of course is imbued with fairies.
Yes.
So Lewis Carroll famously was sort of slightly obsessed with this painting, and once claimed to have counted over 150 fairies embedded in the picture. So he, but again, you've got, Scotland, fairies, his father, artworks. And I mean, interestingly, one of those letters I mentioned earlier to Mary Doyle, February 1884, exactly as this is written, he actually does talk a bit about artwork. He says, I've had that picture you sent me of Papa's nicely framed. I have now in the consulting room 16 pictures hung, including 9 Charles Doyles, which I value at something over £100. Ha, madam, see what a great thief you have for a son. But I do like the idea you've got that, and you've got the gallery, as you say, in Gasterfell. This all feels quite personal, as well as it being evocative of Edinburgh, particularly of the New
He's probably thinking a lot about this because his life is changing. He's establishing himself in his new life in Portsmouth, and thinking back to the old days, I've no doubt. And as you've mentioned before, at this time you've got things like the John Smith.
Yeah,
he's writing. He's also working on Firm of
Girdleston, yeah,
which of course has scenes set in Edinburgh University.
Yeah, it does.
So it's again that's got its own autobiographical element. So he's probably working on these at similar times. The other thing I find of interest in Cowles is that it's very much the locations. It's very much the smarter side of Edinburgh.
Yes,
this is all in the new town.
Yeah.
I mean, you've actually got they're in Robert Louis Stevenson territory as well. In just round the corner is Heriot Row, where Stevenson grew up.
Yeah.
So it's all that the more prosperous middle class area of Edinburgh. You don't hear in this story at all of Cowles and Armitage really wandering into the old town, even though there's obviously parts of the university are there. And Rutherford's the famous drinking haunt of Edinburgh students, which Stevenson was an habitué of. But this definitely it's more set in the middle class world of Edinburgh rather than the kind of the more bohemian side of student life there.
That's right, absolutely. And in addition to Scotland, there's another country that is sort of woven through this, although it's very subtle, and that's India.
Yeah, we find out very early in the story that Cowles himself has a family background in India. His mother has died, His father is still alive. He's a colonel with a Sikh regiment in India. So he's very much with that background. He'll be more sort of based around the northwest frontier, and that sort of area of India. So at the sharp end of things. Regularly. So he's obviously sent his son off to be educated, and it's made quite clear that he isn't enormously interested in his son. So there's that, and we also learn that Cowles has actually been born in India.
Yes.
Which I think is a pretty significant thing, the way the story developed. And then we later get other Indian connections come in with Kate Northcott.
Yeah.
So we're set up early on with a significant Indian connection, and as the story develops and we are introduced to Kate Northcott, we will then find out that there is yet another further Indian connection. But first, of course, we need to really introduce Kate Northcott, who we first encounter in the art gallery. And both Cowles and Armitage are very struck by her when they see her with the man they take to be her fiancé. And Armitage says of her, "I noticed an extremely beautiful woman standing at the other side of the room. In my whole life, I have never seen such a classically perfect countenance. It was the real Greek type, the forehead broad, very low, and as white as marble, with a cloudlet of delicate locks wreathing round it. The nose straight and clean cut, the lips inclined to thinness, the chin and lower jaw beautifully rounded off, and yet sufficiently developed to promise unusual strength of character. But those eyes, those wonderful eyes! If I could but give some faint idea of their varying moods, their steely hardness, their feminine softness, their power of command, their penetrating intensity suddenly melting away into an expression of womanly weakness. But I am speaking now of future impressions. Those eyes are not mentioned there, but they are grey, which is always a sign with Conan Doyle that you've got an interesting character.
Yes, it's true.
But he then describes the almost the fatal moment, and we've already got a hint of her character through the physical description there. But then we get, as I kept my eyes upon them, i.e. Northcott and Reeves. Reeves was called away for some reason, and the young lady was left alone, turning her back to the pictures. So she's obviously not that interested in the art. She passed the time until the return of her escort in taking a deliberate survey of the company, without paying the least heed to the fact that a dozen pair of eyes, attracted by her elegance and beauty, were bent curiously upon her. With one of her hands holding the red silk cord which railed off the pictures, she stood languidly, moving her eyes from face to face with as little self-consciousness as if she were looking at the canvas creatures behind her. Suddenly, as I watched her, I saw her gaze become fixed and, as it were, intense. I followed the direction of her looks, wondering what could have attracted her so strongly. John Barrington Cowles was standing before a picture, one, I think, by Noel Paton. His profile was turned towards us, and never have I seen him to such advantage. And it's that has caught her eye and fixed her eye.
Yeah, so I mean, you get the sense from that description that she's watching out for her next prey, really. She's surveying the room until she latches onto the next person, and so you get very quickly this suggestion of certainly predatory, but with the description of the eye and the gaze, this kind of slightly, sort of penetrating supernatural, paranormal, psychical abilities. And it is interesting that this story is written right at that time. That Conan Doyle is really getting very interested in this. I mean, we mentioned last time about Drayson and about the Portsmouth Literary and Scientific Society. I mean, just to put the dates on that, Conan Doyle joined that society in November 1883, and he's writing this story, 3 months later. So this is right in the midst of that. And And one of the things that we know Conan Doyle would be very interested in was mesmerism, and that's something that runs throughout this story. So a bit of background on mesmerism. It was the creation or popularized by Franz Anton Mesmer, who was working in the 18th century, studied in Vienna, and actually became friends with the young Mozart. He then moved to Paris in his later years and essentially proposed the idea of animal magnetism, which is something that was referenced in that earlier letter that Conan Doyle had written to his mother. Animal magnetism really being the idea that we almost have magnetic forces within ourselves, and that can be manipulated in the same way as the moon affects the tides. And Mesmer's idea was essentially that people were sometimes ill because these things were out of alignment, and therefore through various treatments and what would essentially become kind of like a forerunner of hypnotism. You could, through the power of suggestion, but also through the power of magnets, realign the hydraulics of the body, I think was the basic idea. But there's also a strong sort of performative element to mesmerism as well. So Mesmer actually created the environment in which his subjects could come under influence. He'd use music, he'd use dim lights. He used this bizarre musical instrument called a glass harmonica, which made up a series of glass bowls that all went into harmonics, colored lights and things like that. And he would actually call these things seances, which is interesting. And the sort of veracity of his treatments was never really in doubt. People were, medics were convinced that he was able to change people's behaviors. I mean, one of the people who would is referenced in this is a woman in Mozart's household who he supposedly cured of depression, and Mozart would go on to say how she was a changed person after these mesmeric treatments. So people weren't really in doubt of the power of suggestion, as it were, or of how he was working. It was more about why was it working, and he eventually came a bit of a cropper because once he'd moved to Paris in 1778, it was a few years later that there was a very famous investigation to assess the validity of his claims. And it's notable because it's one of the first investigations that really establishes the burden of scientific proof. Benjamin Franklin was part of the investigating team, as it were, and another Lavoisier, the chemist who discovered the role of oxygen in combustion and eventually died on the guillotine. He was part of the investigation as well, and they basically came to the conclusion that Mesmer's animal magnetism theories didn't really hold sway, but that they worked by the power of suggestion. So they weren't doubting that there was impact, but they were just doubting why it was the case. But mesmerism kept coming back, and one of the great periods of revival was the 1830s, when it came to the attention of Charles Dickens, who was sort of fascinated by mesmerism. He was both fascinated by mesmerism and also rejected spiritualism, but the two are connected in the idea that, mesmerism opens up the potential that ghosts are actually experiences of the mind, again prompted by suggestion. And the other great period in which this started to come back was in the 1870s and 80s. And one of the places where mesmerism was particularly of interest was indeed Edinburgh, where there is a very close connection between the Edinburgh Medical School and the teachings of people like James Braid, who I think coined the term hypnosis, and what was being taught. So it's quite possible that there's a kind of undercurrent of theories of mesmerism in Conan Doyle's medical training as well. I'd love to be able to look into that at some point.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with Mesmer and this sort of pseudoscience is the kind of the showman side of it worried people, the performative aspects. I mean, of course, at the time you got an awful lot of supposedly respectable science is being shown off in lecture theatres and so on at this sort of period of late 18th, early 19th century. I mean, you only have to think about Galvani's experiments, and the sort of public experiments and public displays which helped to inspire Frankenstein.
Yes, yeah.
But it did worry more, shall we say, serious-minded people, the kind of the performance aspect, and you actually get this coming into this story.
You do,
where we get a visitor to Edinburgh giving a public performance, and he is Dr. Messinger, the well-known medium and mesmerist, a man whose performance had been again and again pronounced to be genuine by competent judges. He was far above trickery and had the reputation of being the soundest living authority upon the strange pseudo-sciences of animal magnetism and electrobiology.
Electrobiology. That's brilliant. That sounds like something from Bulwer Lytton.
Yes. So we have Kate Northcott and John Barrington Cowles and Armitage all troop along to see this performance. And as part of the show, Dr. Messenger picks on a member of the audience, and he chooses Cowles to have a sort of battle of wills almost, but he doesn't realise it isn't Cowles he's fighting. It's Kate Northcott, and she overwhelms him.
Yeah,
and it's almost in the context of the story. This is the kind of official pseudoscience side of it versus the natural practitioner almost.
Yes.
In the person of Kate Northcott, she's almost a real magician and a real master of this stuff, and so it's very cleverly done that we then get a discussion of these abilities and how much is science, how much is training, how much is natural.
Yes. Yes, this is taking it beyond the idea of it being an acknowledged power, I think is said in Conan Doyle's letter to his mother. It put me in mind of a couple of things. One of them is that 5 years after writing this story, Conan Doyle would himself attend electromesmerism, in which he went up on stage to be mesmerized, but it didn't work. And the French mesmerist, Monsieur de Meyer, the professor remarked after making the attempt that the process would take too long, apparently, with Conan Doyle. But the other thing it reminded me of was the fact that Conan Doyle had written and not published an article called The Youngest of the Sciences, which is the manuscript actually exists. It's in the Berg collection in the New York Public Library, and it's him putting the case for animal magnetism. But one of the really interesting points in there is that he hits head on this idea that the performative element has really undermined serious consideration of this work. He says, cursed at by the church, ridiculed by the science of the day, tabooed by the French Academy, mesmerism has still persisted in shooting up its head from time to time in defiance both of priest and philosopher. Driven from lecture rooms and laboratories, it has taken refuge in the booth of the conjurer and on the platform of the charlatan. And then he adds, only now at the end of 3 generations does orthodox science show a disposition to welcome back this Ishmael, to rescue it from the sordid uses to which it has been put, and to install it in its rightful place as an approved fact. That's written probably around 1889. The other thing that's interesting in that is that echoes really heavily what Conan Doyle would go on to be talking about in the 1920s when he's talking about mediums. He would talk about the fact that they were fraudulent mediums and people out there who were deliberately obscuring what he saw as the truth. But he would go into a full-throated defense of true mediums.
And note that he calls Messenger a mesmerist and medium.
And medium, yes, that's right. He does. He does indeed, yeah.
And that brings us onto one of the central themes of this story, really, which is this clash, dichotomy, whatever, between these almost semi-respectable pseudosciences or the occult, a certain level of the occult sciences trying to almost bring themselves into the mainstream of science.
Yeah.
And from that, in this story, we then begin to really find out more about Kate Northcott's abilities. And her background certainly isn't in the sciences. This is where we come back to India, and what Conan Doyle was reading at this time.
Yeah, so this would be right at the time that Conan Doyle is getting very heavily interested in theosophy. He's not at this point interested so much in psychical research or indeed in spiritualism. I think you can put that slightly later, but definitely at this time he's met Drayson. He, I think, has met A.P. Sinnett. He certainly, who was an associate of Blavatsky. He'd read Sinnett's The Occult World as well. I mean, in his autobiography, Memories and Adventures, he does talk about almost theosophy as a stage before his more serious interest in spiritualism, I think. He says, I was deeply interested and attracted for a year or two by theosophy, because while spiritualism seemed at that time to be chaos so far as philosophy went, theosophy presented a very well thought out and reasonable scheme, parts of which, notably reincarnation and karma, seem to offer an explanation for some of the anomalies of life. So he's again drawing on this pool, which is mixing all this kind of esoteric Eastern philosophy with new ideas in the West.
Yes, definitely. It's something that give some impression of organized, almost a degree of a kind of orthodoxy imposed upon it. But it is, as you say, it is this westernized grab bag of Eastern philosophies.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can see the appeal at the time to a kind of Western world, post-Darwinian,
yes,
which is wrestling with so many of these questions, and Conan Doyle was not alone in being a young man searching for a belief, for a faith, for anything that seemed certain. So that the quote that you've mentioned, the kind of the almost certainty would be very appealing at that time, but obviously later on looked into things a bit more. And there's also the romantic side of theosophy, which was a very big part of it, and that appealed to Conan Doyle, which is why this sort of philosophy appears so much in his fiction at this period.
It does.
And you definitely get it in this story. As I say, earlier when I mentioned the Indian background to Cowles, we also then find out as he gets closer to Kate Northcott that she too has these connections, and Cowles and Armitage go round to the house Northcott is living at with her aunt, and they go through some old family photographs.
Yes,
it's all very bourgeois, all very harmless, it would seem. And Armitage says of pictures of Kate Northcott's parents that they were apparently ordinary mortals enough. But then he comes to one particular old daguerreotype. He says, it represented a man of about the age of 40 and strikingly handsome. He was clean-shaven. An extraordinary power was expressed upon his prominent lower jaw and firm, straight mouth. His eyes were somewhat deeply set in his head, however, and there was a snake-like flattening at the upper part of his forehead, which detracted from his appearance. I almost involuntarily, when I saw the head, pointed to it and exclaimed, "There is your prototype in your family, Miss Northcott." "Do you think so?" she said. "I'm afraid you are paying me a very bad compliment. Uncle Anthony was always considered the black sheep of the family." "Indeed," I answered. "My remark was an unfortunate one, then." "Oh, don't mind that," she said. "I always thought myself that he was worth all of them put together. He was an officer in the 41st Regiment, and he was killed in action during the Persian War, so he died nobly at any rate." So I've got a number of interesting things going on there.
A few problems with this.
Yes. First of all, the historical background. The Persian War was 1856. It's known as John Company's last war because it was the last war that was fought under the auspices of the East India Company.
Yes.
Before the Indian Mutiny and the dissolution of the East India Company in the aftermath of that. So it was fought so mainly in Indian Army troops with some Queen's regiments along. The 41st was not one of them.
No.
So presumably Uncle Anthony must have been on some sort of secondment to be there. But her reaction is interesting.
Yeah.
Obviously there's this physical resemblance, and I always thought myself that he was worth all of them put together. That's very strong stuff.
Yeah.
Armitage is rather interested in him, and so he gets in touch with an Armitage family friend, Colonel Joyce. And as Armitage says, who would be likely to know most of the officers who'd been out there since the mutiny? Well, that wouldn't be a lot of help.
No.
Considering that the Captain Northcott had died in 1856,
That's right.
i.e. before the mutiny. But nevertheless, he strikes lucky. Colonel Joyce actually knew Northcott. And says, he was not popular in his corps. They said he was a pitiless, cold-blooded fellow, with no geniality in him. There was a rumour, too, that he was a devil worshipper or something of that sort, and also that he had the evil eye, which, of course, was all nonsense. And he finishes the letter. Oh, by the way, Northcott did not fall in action. He was killed after peace was declared in a crazy attempt to get some of the eternal fire from the sun worshippers' temple. There was considerable mystery about his death.
It's a brilliant PS to a letter. It's kind of like the most important thing that you could possibly convey, but you stick it in a PS at the end. But it's wonderful, isn't it? So now we've got the suggestion that, there is some demonic power at work here as well. And I do wonder about the relationship between Kate Northcott and Uncle Anthony.
Quite definitely.
Yeah.
I think we both come to the same conclusion about this. And I think Conan Doyle's pushing us in this direction, that Uncle Anthony isn't Uncle Anthony.
Yeah, Uncle Anthony is definitely her father, I think. And in fact, there was an interesting point that Owen Dudley Edwards made in his introduction to John Barrington Cowles, where he says that, this story was being written at the same time as Conan Doyle was writing his PhD thesis, which was on syphilis. And he says that, he sees John Barrington Cowles in part as a metaphor for syphilis. And of course, one of the important things there was the hereditary aspect. And that's one of the things that Conan Doyle was studying. And I'm not quite sure I entirely agree with Owen's assessment on it, but I like the idea that there's a connection. There's some sort of hidden heredity aspect to this story, and it makes sense that Uncle Anthony is not really Uncle Anthony in that case.
Yeah, absolutely. And the physical similarity. I mean, this we've been, the signposting is all there. About and her, the defense that I've quoted there about he's worth the rest of them put together. That feels like a daughter leaping to father's defense.
Yeah.
Quite definitely. So, and the heredity thing, it's another. It's a theme amongst a lot of Doyle's fiction, and is definitely strong in this. But it brings to mind the question. We've got Cowles born in India. So was Kate Northcott born in India?
Yeah. That's right.
And we don't actually know her age. It's evident that she's not a middle-aged woman, but she's described always as a woman, not a girl.
Yes, that's
you
true.
You never get the word girl about her. So I'm working on the assumption that she's older than the young man she's becoming engaged to, that she has that sort of almost worldly appeal.
Yes.
As well as the beauty. That's part of it, which again brings that Anthony's died in 1856. This is 1879. So she could be about 30.
Yeah, that's right.
And my theory would be that she's born out in India in the early 1850s.
Yes, or even supernaturally older, which would be quite
yes.
Because I mean that's the big point that we probably want to come on to now, which is what is she? What actually is Kate Northcott? The kind of key thing is that she has been engaged to two men and now a third, and the former two have come a cropper in various different ways. The first one was found dead in the lock, I think, and the second has sort of driven himself to drink and ultimately dies. And now John Barrington Cowles is engaged to Kate Northcott, and so we're only awaiting to find out what's going to happen to him. And her sort of modus operandi is to tell them something on the eve of the wedding, but we're never really quite sure what she says. We're never told what it is that she reveals, but it's certainly enough to drive these three men to their respective destructions. And that again put me in mind of the kind of Heredity piece as well. The idea that there might be something that she only reveals about herself right at that last moment where the person has the opportunity to back out of the wedding. Except by now they're definitely not going to be back out there completely under her mesmeric spell. So it's a big question, I think, in this is what is the nature of Kate Northcott?
I mean, we've definitely got the kind of animalistic comparisons with the description of her in the art gallery is very feline. Yet here we get the kind of the reptilian aspect through her uncle.
Yes.
So there's that side of it, and another aspect to it is her violence.
Oh yeah.
There's a very, very strange scene.
I know what you're going to say.
Where the Northcott family dog has misbehaved himself, and she is chastising it with a dog whip, which certainly surprised the enthusiasm and ferocity.
Yes,
of this certainly takes Armitage aback. It's interesting, by the way, that the dog is called Carlo.
it is, isn't it? Yeah.
Another one. Think Copper
fella.
Beaches and the Sussex Vampire. But she not only enjoys, or it seems she's more flushed than usual after this, and it seems she enjoys it. But she has a philosophy,
yes,
as well. And so, what a capital thing! If instead of receiving a collective punishment at the end of our lives, we were to have one at once, when we did anything wicked, it would make us more careful, wouldn't it? I acknowledge that it would. Supposing that every time a man misbehaved himself, a gigantic hand were to seize him, and he were lashed with a whip until he fainted. She clenched her white fingers as she spoke, and cut out viciously with the dog whip. It would do more to keep him good than any number of high-minded theories of morality. Why, Kate, said my friend, you are quite savage today. It's very, very odd scene, and it doesn't seem to put Cowles off.
No. Well, I think there's a bit of a subtext here. It is a very, to our reading now, it's a very funny scene. I think the central point is that there's this element of cruelty in her, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely.
And this is the kind of thing, isn't it? That it's in sense of what does she actually tell them on the eve of the wedding? It's something about revealing her true nature at the point at which they're completely on the hook. So it's all about power and cruelty, I think.
Which you get the hint in the letter from Colonel Joyce.
Yeah,
is one of the things which is underlying Uncle Antony's personality, which is the professional soldier never likes the soldier or the fighting man who enjoys his job too much.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's the hint you're getting about Uncle Antony, and that is again another heredity thing that's coming out here. But the other side to this is that Doyle is tapping into the. We discussed the idea of the femme fatale when we talked about the Nightmare Room, but this is again it's the femme fatale theme.
Yeah.
But this is a different type from in the Nightmare Room. This is a more mature woman.
Yes.
This is the kind of the domineering woman, and ties in very much with a lot of the what was in the air at the time, which had started with the French Romantics, really in the mid 19th century, of the strong femme fatale. She's very, very sort of classical.
Yes.
In theme, more along the kind of the Cleopatra type, which Théophile Gautier in particular was very much interested in. she's like, you know, the vampires of Baudelaire
Yes,
as
that's
well,
right.
very much. And that also ties in when you think of Les Métamorphoses du Vampire with Owen's syphilis theme.
Yeah.
Fits in there quite nicely.
Hmm.
But she's basically, she's predatory and irresistible,
Yeah.
and you've definitely got that. You've got the fascinating snake. You've also got the feline fascinating. The metaphors that Doyle uses
Yes.
are very, very pointed, and she's her charms and her method are both fatal. So he's tapping into and this would all come in, you know, the 1880s, 1890s, part of the whole aesthete decadent.
Yeah.
He's tapping into that, and it's one of the classic studies of that. Mario Pratz's The Romantic Agony.
Hmm.
Pratt says, you know, of this type of character, sexual cannibalism is her monopoly.
Yeah, that's right.
Now that's what's going on here. That's
Yeah.
the sort of character we're talking about, and she's very much tying into all of that. These sort of themes that would be popular, and certainly in England until, you know, the trial of Oscar Wilde and the retreat
Yes.
from decadence.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating that Doyle, who is so associated with kind of in the public eye with boys' own fiction and that sort of thing, is actually just as much in touch with this stream of art.
Yes. And also, I think there's an element of the new woman as well, which would maybe come a bit later as such. But this idea that, you know, men threatened by women finding more of a voice, more of a certainty, you know, and it is fair to say that, you know, Conan Doyle in stories like The Doctors of Hoyland is talking about positively about the new woman, but there's a strong element in this, I think, where he is talking about her having both sort of masculine and feminine characteristics. You can easily read this as being something which is quite uncertain about the new place of women in society, and that also is feeding into exactly what you're talking about with the decadent movement too. So, you know,
and you later on with the whole decadent side of this sort of character, one of the most important texts is you know, some 10 years off, with The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, and Helen Vaughan, who is the central character in that, who is born of an occult experiment.
Yes.
But she has the same sort of, it's almost like as if Kate Northcott is a prototype of Helen Vaughan. It'd be interesting to know if Machen had read this story and got some ideas from it, because there's some real similarities going on, and Helen Vaughan is every man that she becomes involved with. There's a whole space of suicides.
That's right.
On the back of it, and she too. It's after she's revealed a secret which we, the reader, are never told.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a very similar,
similar
setup, and it's perhaps more sophisticated. It's a later development, but Doyle is really on the right track with this, and making a very, very interesting early type of this story.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's interesting is that, you know, The Great God Pan is in many ways a mystery detective novel as well, and people are trying to work out what's going on. So there's another inheritance of Conan Doyle potentially in that as well. But I like the point particularly about, you know, they're both, you know, conceivably both Northcott and Vaughan are born of occult experiments. You know?
Yeah, it's because we have this mystery about Kate Northcott. That we're never told. I mean, in the Great God Pan, we actually do find out, you know, the origins. We never know what exactly she's told.
Yeah,
the men, but we do get her background, and you know, we know how she was born.
Yes,
which Doyle keeps veiled. In his story.
Yeah. So we're never quite told exactly what it is that she says, but we do certainly see the reaction on John Barrington Cowles. He gives a very significant speech. He looked at me with a vacant stare and then suddenly burst out waving his arms. "A fiend," he cried, "a ghoul from the pit, a vampire soul behind a lovely face. Now, God forgive me," he went on in a lower tone, turning his face to the wall. "I have said more than I should. I have loved her too much to speak of her as she is. I love her too much now. So he's completely consumed, completely hooked by her, and eventually he will essentially run to his death. And there's a peculiar moment where she seems to appear in front of him almost like a kind of astral projection, which gets us into the whole business of, what exactly is she? A ghoul from the pit, a vampire. There's lots of things mixed up in that paragraph itself.
Well, we get, again, just after he said that to Armitage, he goes, "There is a story," he said thoughtfully, "in one of Marryat's books about a beautiful woman who took the form of a wolf at night and devoured her own children. I wonder what put that idea into Marryat's head."
Yeah.
So you've got that kind of the werewolf idea being thrown in. It's just, again, we were talking earlier about grab bags.
Yes, completely.
What we've got here is that, and with the idea of the vampire, we've got. He's at no point suggesting she's the kind of classic blood-sucking vampire. It's a vampire soul.
It is.
Rather than that, but again, she does fit in with some of the more sort of vampiric characters that again Doyle would have been familiar with. So I'm thinking of things like Clarimonde.
Yes.
By Gautier again, La Mort Amoureuse, 1836. You've got some of Poe's characters, like Morella and Ligeia.
Yes.
All these sort of, they're not vampires per se.
Yeah.
But you've also got actual vampires like Carmilla.
Yeah.
Although her victims are exclusively female.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing. It's this predation thing. The kind of the more interesting side of the vampire character.
Yeah.
Is coming out in this story, and then the werewolf ideology, where the devouring of her own children and so on, and it's almost like he feels Northcott is devouring him.
Yeah,
not in a literal sense.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I mean, when you mentioned about the astral projection, of course, that also features in The Winning Shot, which we've discussed before, with the male version of Kate Northcott, Octavius Gaster.
Yes, that's right.
And he actually throws a different type of astral projection in that story. So this idea, it's something else that Doyle is getting from his reading, the idea of the astral plane and astral projection.
Yes.
Which also enters into this, and there is the idea that is this in Cowles' head, or does Armitage see something?
Yeah, that's right.
Again, the ambiguity.
Yeah.
Is all there.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that he throws in the specific case of werewolf, because, he does specifically say ghoul, vampire, and he says werewolf. So he's throwing them all in. And that's an interesting case in point as well, because really the rules of monsters haven't been sorted at this time. This is this is 13 years before Dracula. This is, and even then, it's probably not until the 1930s Universal movies that you start.
Yeah, I was going to say we've got a 1940s Universal monster mashup movie.
That's right. Yes, that's right. That's right. But I mean, I do like this reference to this Marryat story, which is. The novel he's referring to is The Phantom Ship, 1839. The actual story is often, it was lifted by Montague Summers for this famous supernatural omnibus in the 30s as The White Wolf of the Harz Mountains. And that's how certainly I read it first. I don't think many people read The Phantom Ship anymore, but they'll have read this story, I think.
No, I mean, this is chapter 39.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, the interesting thing is Conan Doyle is picking out already that this is the good bit of The Phantom Ship. but yeah, I mean, that it's a really horrific story. It's properly disgusting, really. The thing that I thought was interesting, a little nod in it, is that in The White Wolf of the Harz Mountains, you get the werewolf character is first introduced in a coat lined with a white fur, and similarly when we get Kate Northcott first appearing, she's wearing a dark dress with a white fur around her as well. So I think he is very much kind of feeding off this stuff, but it's not a werewolf as we would kind of think of it today, because all the sort of lore hasn't been established. It's much more of a kind of as you say, a grab bag.
And one of the most striking parts of this story as well is that it's often been said of horror stories that they are inherently conservative
Mm.
because they tend to be, the evil is wiped out and order is reestablished at
Mm.
the end of most horror stories. This one, after the death of Cowles, we don't know what happens to Kate.
No, we don't.
There is no no retribution.
No.
So as we've already discussed, we don't know how old she actually is. We don't know how long she'll keep going, and it's similar as well to the winning shot at the end of that. The bad
Yes.
guy is victorious.
That's right.
Again, he gets away. There's no retribution for him. And similarly, you could also say with Doyle again, Uncle Jeremy's household.
Yeah, that's right.
Miss Warrender in that
Yeah.
gets away with it. It's very interesting that Doyle doesn't do the obvious morality thing,
No.
he leaves things in a state of flux, in a state of chaos.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting for a story at this time, aiming at these sort of markets.
Yeah.
That there is this almost. I mean, this one and Winning Shot they're both. It's pretty bleak ending.
Yeah, it is a very bleak ending, and this power is still a threat. It's great. It's a wonderful ending, actually. I think
It's similar in a way as well to the ending of The Captain of the Pole Star.
Yeah,
With
right.
but with that one, there's a degree of kind of happy ending because the captain is reunited with his lost love.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's not the bleakness of this story.
No. And as we come to sort of closing this episode of the podcast, we should say that, all these themes get revisited again 10 years later in The Parasite in 1894, which is kind of very much a companion piece. But I think we've deliberately decided to keep that for another time, as it were, since there's lots to go out there.
Notably, that's the same year as The Great God Pan.
Yeah, that's right.
One other thing I would say about Cowles as well is that it wasn't included in the Conan Doyle stories.
No, it wasn't.
So it's again one of those stories. As Doyle looked at it, maybe doesn't like the bleak message, and also the fact that we're having this slight attack on Dr. Messenger. And messages about the danger of these powers that doesn't fit in with his philosophy in 1929.
Yeah, and I think possibly by then as well, it's a much more liberated time, and there's kind of sexual subtext in this. Might well, he might not want to sort of bring that back out again when it comes to publication. So that brings us to the end of this episode. If you'd like to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you'd like to find out how to be a supporter of the podcast, then also visit the website where you can find out how you can become a patron, either at Patreon or via PayPal. So, Paul, what are we looking at next month?
Well, next month we'll be looking at an old favourite of everybody, but in a new way for us. So we're going to look at a much requested story, The Lost World. But what we're going to do, instead of doing the whole novel, is we'll do half of it up until the team leave for South America. So it just allows us to explore things, so to speak, in a more detailed way than if we just did the novel in one go.
Brilliant. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Then you can monster mash into my graveyard smash. You'll catch on in a flash. Then you can monster mash.